Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. Today we're going to talk about discipline, both self and other. In the context of a lot of events, I have noticed that people take glee in performing their politics over being disciplined to enact and embody their politics. Now, this is both a moral and a political failing, but we have to separate those two things out. I have said before, discipline, particularly self-discipline, is the root of self-care. Not only does self-discipline enable you to truly enjoy things, without the consequences of that enjoyment overwhelming you and dulling your senses to them, but also it enables you to be truly free, at least in regards to yourself, as much as anyone can. To quote the Kenyan runner Eliud Kipchoge, only the disciplined ones in life are free. If you are undisciplined, you are a slave to your moods and your passions. Now, there's a place in life for your moods and passions. Your moods and passions help you decide what you are going to devote your discipline to. But your discipline is your limiting principle and your guide. In the last 2 weeks, I've seen people making all kinds of unscrupulous jokes, speculating wildly about the meaning of things, and also attacking people who did not agree with their speculation. And this was fundamentally either a lack of self-discipline or people trying to take advantage of people's lack of self-discipline, the ability to project upon others. We live in a post-truth age. We can believe whatever we want, and we should do this because if we don't, we're behind in the stakes. And shut up. This is self-justifying rationale of either enabling someone to use you or to allow yourself to be used. I have encouraged people when speaking about political events, from the assassination of Charlie Kirk to what they think politically should happen, to be disciplined about it. Not just to self-censor, but to try to speak as objectively as possible. And when they had passion, have that passion be for a reason. My weakness that I discipline myself against is not sloth. It's not gluttony exactly, although I have periods of my life where I've struggled with that. It is anger. It is limiting myself from the want to moralize, because the moralizing doesn't just hurt my politics or my ability to understand other models of mind, not just for empathy or to be able to come to common agreement with them, but also, frankly, to be able to understand what the person I am opposed to is likely to do next and why they are likely to do it. And that requires empathy. The conservative war on empathy that you've seen in some ways is an extension of the liberal misunderstanding of what empathy is for, which is not just to see yourself and someone else and to fear their suffering and to soften their blows. It is also to predict their model of mind, to understand them, to learn how to incorporate them or defeat them. To know who you can work with, who you can make concessions to, and who you can't. But also, we are stuck, to use a Lacanian word, in the jouissance, the false joy of always expressing our opinions as if the expression of our opinions manifests those opinions in reality. I hate to tell you, but for most people, what is possible and what they say are probably more far apart than they've ever been as far as what is socially enactable, even if the technology allows it to be possible in a material sense. And this is because they cannot discipline themselves to see through the immediate response and see beyond that immediate response. It is discipline and discipline alone that will help you do that. It is discipline and discipline alone that will keep you limited on your speculations. It is discipline and discipline alone that will not make you a subject to someone manipulating and your projections, your passions, your moods, your weaknesses, your fears. Self-discipline is not the enemy of joy in life. It is not the enemy of left-wing politics. It is not the enemy of any of that. You need it. But let's talk about material reasons why you do not have it. You are atomized. You are often reduced to your parasocial relations. And people responding to you are too. I was listening to a liberal podcast make fun of the male loneliness epidemic as if it is not real. There's plenty of evidence for it. And what they are actually doing is saying that, oh, it is real, but it's justified, even though, again, they're not dealing with it. It makes them feel good to not have empathy for people who, even though those people look like them, these are white male liberals, many of whom come from working class origins, who are shaming people who are like where they come from. This logic of distinction to prove you are a good one won't even work for them, but that does not matter. The reason why they do it is it confirms their self-image and degrades the concerns of their enemies. And you don't have to just look at liberals to see this. Leftists and conservatives do it too. There's no conservative principle now that is limited by the prior things they complained about. To quote Frank Herbert, when I am weak, I appeal to your principles so that I can get things according to mine. And when I am strong, I question you according to my principles because I have the capacity to do it. Now, Herbert wasn't saying this was a good thing. He was saying this was a pernicious logic of power. The limiting principles that people often adopted in liberal society was to limit the effects of this, because politics is fundamentally based on violence. And for violence not to overwhelm society and fundamentally eat it up in stasis, in civil war, in social strife, discipline is required. And even when social strife is necessary, it is discipline that stops you from cannibalizing your own. And honestly, it most often fails. Because your relations to others are the number one thing that enables you probably to be disciplined. I do not mean that you're subject yourself to the wheel of some abstract collective. Although, if you had to discipline to maintain a party line, many of you would, you do not. You cannot keep yourself from mocking the enemy. Whether it's good or bad, it makes you feel good, so you do it. It is a dopamine response that you have been encouraged and incentivized in our society to give into. And I'm not sure the self-discipline alone can get you beyond that. But I am sure that without self-discipline, you stand no chance. There will be no aggregate meeting of the individual with the collective to enable something new, to move something for itself without the discipline to understand how your own needs and your own freedoms are better helped by your ability to control yourself. There are always good reasons why people are not self-disciplined, and it is not the same for every person. Liberals aren't wrong about that. But the idea that we are to encourage people to give in to their victimization by encouraging a lack of self-discipline removes anybody from being a political actor, much less a collective political subject. It is time to get disciplined. It is time to limit how you speak. It is time to know that you will never be fully coherent and you will never be fully unbiased and you will never be fully objective. But if you want to be able to fight on the grounds that are not just force versus force. You must try to be those things. And if you cannot, it is what force decides. And most of you do not have that force. Watch how you show yourself in politics. Watch how you behave in public. Act like you have some sense. We all lose it sometimes, but you need the self-discipline to bring that back. When you talk about building a party, how could you ever maintain a political program without the discipline to limit what you do based on this? To speak openly and honestly and keep your disagreements in the open, but keep the fact that you have agreed to by participation to certain conditions. And if you cannot live up to those conditions and a voluntary association, it is your responsibility to leave. That requires discipline and discernment. But discipline first. If I sound angry, it is because I am. The amount of rampant speculation and rampant abuse and parasocial attachment. You are led by fucking comedians. Excuse my anger. Comedians. Yes, it is true that the jesters in medieval society told the prince the truth that they often did not want to hear, but they also mocked the people that the prince wanted mocked and served more than just the Shakespearean notion of a jester. If you do not understand that, you do not know that comedians exist by telling you what makes you feel good. It is the unhappy consciousness and the reconciliation of what it takes to build a happy life that drives most people. That's something you cannot do alone. You need friends, you need comrades, you need colleagues, you need enemies. It is something that no superficial self-identification with any other identity will bring you in and of itself. Oppression can force that upon some people because survival then will demand discipline, but even that is not a promise and not forever. This week, I did not put out a video on Monday because I went out to the desert and then to see a concert to clear my head. Remember, as I said, discipline is self-care, but self-care is also discipline. Because the rolling speculations and inability to control yourself infested my brain. And it was ill-disciplined to continue participating in it. And I found myself increasingly unable to do so. So I did what everyone does when they build discipline. Instead of demanding you lift yourself up by your bootstraps, I started with what I knew I could control and built from there and built my feedback loops myself. Get it together, people. Regardless of your gender, regardless of your race. And yes, I know that you don't have it all the same difficulty in life. Under the society, that's absolutely true. There is no justice that we start out with here. If you want anything like justice, you need the self-discipline to make it and the self-discipline to limit it. Can you conceive that? Do you have it? Or will you give in to all the grifters and everything else that feeds your dopamine receptors? Will you make excuses for yourself and flatter yourself as if yourself and your political enemy are somehow fundamentally separate in ways that do not implicate you ever? That makes people feel good. It makes them feel special. And you, if you want to be an effective actor and you want to be truly free, will have to see beyond that. Not just from others, but from also yourself. I have warned many times about emotivism, and I'm going to talk about Aristotle in a series, and I'm going to talk about Volman in a series. I'm going to talk about all kinds of stuff in a series, but I wanted to get to one thing on emotivism, which is what lack of discipline tends to bring you. It is not lack of rationality that brings you to emotivism, because rationality can invert itself to the emotive. In fact, if we understand this biochemically, we know that the reason brain and the emotive brain are still processes of the same chemical reflections, and that distinction is one that we impose on those. No, it is discipline that enables you to combine abstract reason with emotive normative commitments. This is from Moral Disagreement Today and the Claims of Emotivism, which is a chapter in After Virtue by Alasdair MacIntyre. I am reading from the 1981 edition. I believe this is the second edition. Oh, no, it was originally published in 2010. This is the third edition. The 1981 edition is the first edition. This is why we check things. Sometimes I misquote myself. One philosophical theory which this challenge specifically invites us to confront is emotivism. Emotivism is the doctrine that all evaluative judgments, and more specifically all moral judgments, are nothing but, that's the key, not completely separate, but are nothing but expressions of preference, expressions of attitude or feeling, insofar that they are moral or evaluative in character. Particular judgments may, of course, unite moral and factual elements. Arson, being destructive of property, is wrong, unites the factual judgment that arson destroys property with the moral judgment that arson is wrong. But the moral element in such a judgment is always to be sharply distinguished from the factual. Factual judgments are true or false, and in the realm of fact, there are rational criteria by means of which we may secure agreement as to what is true and what is false. But moral judgments, being expressions of attitude or feeling, are neither true nor false, and the agreement in moral judgment is not to be secured by any rational method, for there are none. That is secured, if at all, by producing certain non-rational effects on the emotions or attitudes of those who disagree with one. No limiting principle, as I would say. We use moral judgment only to express our own feelings and attitudes, but precisely to produce such effects in others. Emotivism is thus a theory which professes to give an account of all value judgments whatsoever. Clearly, if it is true, all moral disagreements is rationally interminable. And clearly, if that is true, then a certain features of contemporary moral debate, to which I draw attention to earlier, do indeed have nothing to do with what is specifically contemporary. But is it true? Emotivism has been presented by its most sophisticated protagonist hitherto as a theory about the meaning of sentences which are used to make moral arguments. C.L. Stevenson, the single most important exponent of the theory, asserts that the sentence, "This is good," roughly means the same as "I approve of this, do so as well," trying to capture by this equivalence both the function of the moral judgment as expressive of the speaker's attitudes and the function of the moral judgment as designed to influence the hearer's attitudes. Stevenson, 1945, chapter 2. Other emotivists suggested that to say "this is good" was an utterance that means roughly "hurrah for this." But as a theory of meaning of a certain type of sentence, emotivism plainly fails in at least three different reasons. The first is that the theory is to elucidate the meaning of certain class of sentences by referring to their function when uttered of expressing feeling or attitudes. An essential part of the theory will have to consist of an identification and characterization of the feeling or attitude in question. On the subject, of proponents of the emotive theory are in general silent, and perhaps wisely, for all attempts so far to identify the relevant types of feelings or attitudes have found it impossible to avoid empty circularity. Moral judgments express feelings and attitudes, it is said. What kinds of feelings or attitude, we ask. Feelings of attitudes of approval is the reply. What kind of approval, we ask, perhaps remarking that approval is of many kinds. It is in answer to this question that every version of emotivism remains either silent or by identifying the relevant kind of approval as moral approval, that is, becomes an approval expressed by specifically moral judgment, becomes vacuously circular. It becomes easy to understand why the theory is vulnerable to the first type of criticism if we consider two reasons for rejecting it. One is that emotivism, as a theory of meaning of a certain type of sentence, is engaged in an impossible task from the beginning because it is dedicated to characterizing as equivalent in meaning two kinds of expressions which, as we have already seen, derive their distinction functions in our language in key part to the contrast and difference between them. And I have already suggested that there are good reasons for distinguishing between what I call expressions of personal preference and evaluative, including moral expressions, citing the way in which an utterance of the first kind depends upon who others dim to whom for reasons given force that they may have, while the utterances of the second kind are not similarly dependent for their reason giving force on the context of the utterance. This seems sufficient to show that there is in some large difference in meaning between the members of the two classes. Yet the emotive theory, which to make them equivalent in meaning. This is not just a mistake. It is a mistake that demands an explanation. A sign of where the explanation could be sought is found in a third defect of emotive theory, considered as a theory of meaning. The emotive theory, as we have seen, purports to be a theory about the meaning of sentences, but the expression of feelings or attitude is characteristically a function not of the meaning of sentences, but of their use in a particular occasion. The angry schoolmaster, to use one of Gilbert Ryle's examples, may vent his feelings by shouting at the small boy who just made an arithmetical mistake. 7 times 7 equals 49. But the use of the sentence to express the feelings or attitude has nothing whatsoever to do with its meaning. This suggests that we should not simply rely on the objections to reject the emotive theory, but we should rather consider whether it ought not to be been proposed as a theory about the use, understood as the purpose or function, of members of a certain class of expressions, rather than their meaning, understood as including all that frega intended by sense and reference. Clearly, the argument so far shows that when someone utters a moral judgment, such as this is right or this is good, it does not mean the same as I approve of this, do this as well, or hurrah for this, or any other attempts at equivalence suggested by an emotive theorist. I'll get to what this has to do with discipline in a second. But even if the meaning of such sentences were quite other than the emotive theorists suppose, it might be plausibly claimed, if evidence was adequate, that using such sentences to say whatever they mean, the agent is in fact doing nothing other than expressing his feelings or attitudes and attempting to influence the feelings and attitudes of others. If emotive theory is thus interpreted, were correct, it would follow that the meaning and use of moral expressions were, at the very least, have become radically discrepant with each other. Meaning and use would be at odds in a way that meaning and use tend to conceal use. But we would not safely infer what someone had other than moral judgment was doing merely by listening to what he said. Moreover, the agent himself might be among those for whom use was concealed by meaning. He might well, precisely because he was self-conscious about the meaning of words he was used, be assured that he was appealing to an independent and personal criteria, when all the way he was in fact doing, all he was doing was expressing his feelings to others in a manipulative way. How might such a phenomenon come to occur? Let us, in light of such considerations, disregard emotivism's claim to the universality of scope. And let us instead consider emotivism as a theory which has been advanced in historically specific conditions. In the 18th century, Hume embodied emotivist elements in the large and complex fabric of his total moral theory. But it is only in this century, the 20th, not the 21st, that emotivism has flourished as a theory on its own. And it did so as a response to a set of theories which flourished, especially in England, between 1903 and 1939. We ought to therefore ask whether emotivism as a theory may not have been a response to, and in fact, the very first instance, an account of not, as its protagonists indeed suppose, moral language as such, but moral language in England in the years after 1903, and when that language was interpreted in accordance with the body of theory to the refutation of which emotivism was primarily dedicated. The theory in question borrowed from an early 19th century name of intuitionism, and its immediate progenitor was G.E. Moore. I went up to Candles at Michaelmas in 1902, and More's Principia Ethica came out at the end of my first year. It was exciting, exhilarating, the beginning of a renaissance, the opening of a new heaven on a new earth. So wrote Jarred Maynard Keynes, quoted in Rosenbaum 1975, page 52. And so, in their rhetorical modes, Lyndon Strangely and Desmond McCarthy, and later Virginia Woolf, who struggled through Principia Ethica page by page in 1908, and a whole network of Cambridge and London friends and acquaintances. What opened the New Havens as More's quiet but apocalyptic proclamation in 1903 that after many centuries he had at last solved the problems of ethics by being the philosopher to attend with sufficient care the precise nature of the question which had been its task of ethics to answer. What More believed he had discovered by attenuating to the precise nature of these questions was threefold. First, that good is simply the name of an indefinable property, a property different than that which is named pleasant or conducted to evolutionary survival or any other natural property. Hence, More speaks of good as a non-natural property. Propositions declaring this or that to be good are what More called intuitions. They are incapable of proof or disproof, and indeed no evidence or reasoning whatsoever can be deduced in their favor or disfavor. Although More declaims any use of the word intuition, which might suggest the name of a faculty of intuition compared to our power of vision. He nonetheless does compare good as a property which yellow as a property in the same way as to make the verdicts that give a state of affairs is or is not good comparable to the simplest judgments of normal visual perception. Secondly, More takes it to call and as a call to action. Right is simply to say that the available alternative actions is one which does and did not matter. A fact produced the most good. More is thus utilitarian. Every action has to be evaluated solely by its consequences as compared to the consequences of alternative possible actions. And as with at least some versions of utilitarianism, it follows that no action is ever right or wrong as such. Anything whatsoever may be under circumstances be permitted. Thirdly, it turns out to be the case in the sixth and final chapter of the Principia Ethica that the personal affectations and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest and by far the greatest goods we can imagine. This is the ultimate and fundamental truth of moral philosophy. This achievement of friendship and contemplation of what is beautiful in nature or in art and become almost the sole and perhaps sole justifiable ends of all human action. What we ought to notice immediately is two crucial facts about More's moral theory. The first is that there are three central positions that are logically independent of each other. There would be no breadth and consistency if one were to affirm any one of the three and deny the other two. One can be a intuitionist without being a utilitarian. Most English intuitionists came to hold the view that there was a non-natural property of right as well as of good, and held to perceive a certain type of action was right, was to see that one at least had prima facie obligation to perform that type of action independently of its consequences. Likewise, a utilitarian has no necessary commitment to intuitionism, and neither utilitarians nor intuitionists have necessary commitments to the values of More's sixth chapter. The second crucial fact is to see retrospectively. The first part of what More says is plainly false, and the second and third parts are at very least highly contentious. More's argument at times are, it must seem now obviously defective. He tries to show good as indefinable, for example, by relying on a bad dictionary definition of definition, and a great deal is asserted rather than argued. And it is this, to us, plainly false, badly argued position that Keynes treated as the beginning of a renaissance, and which Stanton Stretchley declared to be shattered all writers' ethics on Aristotle to Christ to Herbert Spencer to Mr. Bradley, and to what Leonard Woolf described as substituting for the religious and philosophical nightmares, delusions, and hallucinations which Jehovah, Christ, St. Paul, Plato, Kant, and Hegel have entangled us, the fresh air and pure light of common sense, quoted in God 1974. This is great silliness, of course, but is a great silliness of highly intelligent and perceptive people. It is therefore worth asking, can we discern any clues as to why they accepted More's naive and complacent apocalypticism? One suggests itself. It is that the group who were to become the Bloomsburys Bloomsbury had already accepted the values of Morris' six preferences. They felt the need to find objective and impersonal justification for rejecting all claims except those of personal intercourse and of the beautiful. And what specifically were they rejecting? Not, in fact, the doctrines of Plato or St. Paul or any other great names in Wolf's or Stransley's catalog of deliverances, but the names as symbols of a culture of the 19th century. Sedgwick and Leslie Stevens are best dismissed, along with Spencer and Bradley, and the whole past is envisioned as a burden that More helped us cast them off. What was it about the moral culture of the late 19th century was made the burden to be escaped from? The question to which an answer ought to be deferred precisely because it's going to be forced on us more than once in the course of the argument, and later on we shall be better equipped to answer it. But we ought to notice the dominant theme of the rejection in the lives of the writings of Wolves, Lyndon Stanley, or Roger Fry. Keynes emphasized the rejection not only of the Benthamite version of utilitarianism and of Christianity, but of all claims on behalf of social action conceived as a worthwhile end. What is left? The answer is the highly impoverished view of how good may be used. And those use values become a substitute for the discipline of trying to be consistent. And one can come up with an entire philosophical justification for it, but that justification is always emergent of one's already existing social categories to which one is reacting. It takes discipline to break from that. Discipline that makes you free to break on that. And ironically, that discipline is what makes you free because it is you that limits your actions and not someone else. And if you choose to subordinate yourself to something bigger than you, you have chosen it of your own volition. I'm not saying free will because I do not know if such a thing exists. But it is of your will nonetheless. To not be caught up in the immediate propositions of one's time, and also not to just invert them in some new form to propel revolutions while one is blindly grabbed on to the implications of ideas in history. It requires discipline to start to limit yourself to do that. Not just intellectually, but physically, but socially, and how you express yourself on social media and how you behave. Ethics and politics are not the same thing. But I will tell you, it is hard to do one without the other. At least in a way that inspires people to trust you enough that you are not just forcing them to be your subordinate. Because when you force people to be a subordinate, they will use you to climb up the ranks and then devour your memory. Protect your peace and be disciplined. Watch what you say. And if you say something inflammatory, have it be deliberate, not just for jouissance of whatever flare up you'll get from a fucking like, which substitutes for any real obligation and connection which you may have. Good day.